I started out as a mathematician, as an undergraduate student in Adelaide. And I was always interested in the really foundational questions, the bottom level of reality. We've got this idea that underneath biology, there's chemistry, and underneath chemistry, there's physics. And I thought, well, underneath all that is mathematics. So that was what initially drew me in, I guess, as a teenage geek, and then going on to university. But over time, it gradually, I guess, came to seem to me that even more fundamental than any of that is philosophy, the underlying questions about existence, reality, and consciousness. Why is there anything at all? Why do we have minds? Why is the world the way it is? So I just got inexorably drawn into philosophical thinking, and I went overseas. I went to Oxford to do a graduate degree in maths, but the whole time I was there, I was just thinking about philosophy. And after a year or two of that, I basically decided, well, I might as well, instead of just thinking about these crazy philosophical ideas of my own in my spare time, I might as well do this properly. And I mean, it was a long story, but I ended up moving to the US and doing my PhD there in philosophy and cognitive science, the study of the mind. What really drew me into philosophy was just the study of consciousness. It just seemed to me that this was the most interesting unsolved problem in the world. How is it that a bunch of neurons hooked up in some incredibly complicated way inside your skull is going to produce the subjective experience of a conscious mind? And I thought, well, this is the thing in science that we just don't understand. I mean, 500 years ago, maybe I'd been working on the nature of matter or gravity or so on, or 100 years ago on biology and life and so on. But right now, it just seemed to me this question about consciousness was the most interesting question in the world. I didn't think of it especially as, well, I want to do philosophy. I thought of it initially as I want to understand consciousness. And philosophy seemed to be the way, right now at least, to approach that. Consciousness is basically how the mind and the world feel from the inside. Consciousness is your perspective on reality. So we've got this amazing movie running through our minds all the time, full of images, colors and shapes, sounds, tastes, smells, but also emotions, the feeling of happiness and sadness, a stream of conscious thought, talking to yourself, and so on. Consciousness is basically that first-person perspective on reality. And it's mysterious because you look at the brain from the outside, and as far as anyone could tell, we look like giant robots. The input comes in, and stuff gets processed in the mind like a big computer, and produces an output, and so on, with these giant machines. But why should a giant machine like that have a first-person perspective on the world? Why should it feel like something from the inside? Why should it feel happy or feel pain or see colors and so on? So that for me is the mystery of consciousness. Sometimes I like to say there's 3 different kinds of zombies out there. There's the Hollywood zombies, who I guess are dead and brought back to life. There's the Haitian voodoo zombies, who I guess they're lacking certain kind of free will. They've had this poison, and the free will has been sucked out of them. Well, philosophical zombies, they're like the consciousness has all been sucked out of them. So they're physical duplicates of ordinary human beings, but without any consciousness at all. Nothing on the inside. So they're like a zombie, as far as philosophers are concerned, is a giant robot, physical. I've got a zombie twin in the universe next door. Looks just like me, talks like me, and so on. But nothing's going on the inside. Slap him on the arm, he won't feel pain, won't feel happy, won't feel sad, but he'll react and talk just like you and just like me. So, I could be talking to you, you could be talking to me, and you could say, well, all you actually see is my behavior. For all you know, I could be a zombie. For all I know, you could be a zombie. I presume you're not. I'm conscious, I presume you're conscious too, but it just raises all these questions. How do we know that the people around us aren't zombies? And what is it that makes the difference between us and zombies? Why didn't evolution produce zombies? It didn't. It produced conscious beings. So zombies are a way of throwing these really central philosophical questions about consciousness into sharp relief. We philosophers like to talk about other possible worlds, with different laws of nature and different physics and so on. It strikes me there's at least a possible world where there are zombies, where there's someone who's a lot like me, behaving a lot like me, internal structure a lot like me, but in which there's no consciousness. And if that's even possible in some abstract sense, even if it can't happen in our world, that tells us there's something importantly different about our world. There's consciousness, and it seems to be an extra part of our world. Sometimes I put this by saying, well, when God created the world, just as a kind of metaphor, he had to do more than just create all the physical structures, had to put consciousness in too. And this is what leads me towards the idea that consciousness might be best viewed as one of the fundamental building blocks of reality. Philosophy has been one of the few fields where you can actually work on consciousness and it be a respectable mainstream topic. That's gradually coming to change now in psychology and neuroscience. You can work on these things in an experimental way, but still for someone like me who wants to take the big picture on these things, if you're working on it from within psychology or neuroscience, you'll be sitting at a lab, doing some very specialized experiments on aspects of behavior or on certain neurons, maybe in monkeys, and so on. And it's only a very small piece of the puzzle at a time, which is not to say there's incredibly interesting work going on in that field from a number of people all over the world, but I'm interested in kind of putting the pieces together. So as a philosopher, we sit back and we think about the big picture. We take into account all the stuff that's coming from psychology or from neuroscience or from physics and so on. And then we sort of reflect on this from a theoretical framework and just try to put it all together into a grand perspective on what is consciousness and how does it fit into nature. If you're a scientist, you're allowed to do that maybe once you're 60 and you've got a Nobel Prize. But, as a philosopher, you can be doing this all along. And I guess that was the attraction for me. Well, I guess this is a study not in consciousness, but in self-consciousness. You've got this artist staring at you and transferring you onto bits of paper. And, what do? I just sit there and try not to look like too much of a fool. It was a fascinating process. Nick Mourtzakis, the artist, was sitting just a meter away from me. We were both sitting down on chairs facing each other, and he just got out this ruler and started drawing lines. Like all the lines he was seeing, and I just kind of sat there, and I could see what he was doing and how it evolved upside down from my perspective. And then maybe after half an hour or an hour, he'd say, okay, I'm done with that sketch, and get up and show it to me, and I'd look at it, and it would look like a big mess of extremely abstract geometrical lines. So, vaguely, I'm not an expert in painting, but it struck me as vaguely sort of cubist in style. But it was quite fascinating. I had a lot of good conversation with Nick during the process. He has many ideas about philosophy himself. So we were talking about some of his ideas about painting and art and consciousness and what you represent. But basically, he had to do all the hard work. I just had to sit there and see the result.
The way Nick has actually drawn you, there's kind of like two sides to the portrait. There's a big gaping kind of gap down the middle.
Uh-huh.
Do you see that as something maybe of Nick's ideas around illustrating this kind of dualism process that philosophy sometimes tends to force people into?
Oh boy, interesting idea. First time I'd thought about that. And I guess you'd have to ask Nick about that. But I don't mind dualities. I find them very useful in understanding things. As philosophers, we like to make distinctions and to understand the world. There's, even if two things are ultimately separate, you've got to first, or ultimately the same, you've got to ultimately separate them in order to bring them together. Okay, if I'm thinking about consciousness, well, I've got to really make a sharp separation between what's in consciousness and what's in the external world, what's in the mind and what's in the body, just to at least to separate out the phenomenon that we're trying to study. Now, it's possible that after separating these things, then we're going to come back to a more holistic and integrated perspective and say, okay, here's how just one big unified thing could be underlying the mind and the body, consciousness and the world, and so on. But we've at least got to make those distinctions to start with. So I'm not opposed to dualities. The idea that our minds actually aren't confined just to the area inside our skulls or our brains, but in effect extend into the environment, and all the things we use when we're thinking in our environment as tools become parts of our mind. So a simple example might be counting on my fingers. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 5 plus 3 is 8. I figured out 5 plus 3 is 8 with the aid of my fingers. So somehow these were acting as part of my thinking process, if you like, in doing mathematics. Okay, that's a simple example, but now with computer technology and so on, this is really going crazy. So all of us these days use a mobile phone. Here's my iPhone. This iPhone is now basically serving as part of my memory. We're used to the idea that we look up phone numbers on the phone. Well, basically, we used to have to remember phone numbers with our biological memory. Now the phone does it all. In effect, the iPhone is serving as my memory. And you might say, okay, well, it's a tool that I'm using. But the thesis I've tried to put forward with my colleague Andy Clark and work on this is to say, no, literally, actually, what's happening is your mind is now extending into the world, and the iPhone is becoming part of my mind. It doesn't make any difference whether it's biological memory inside the skull or a phone outside the skull. If it's doing the same job, it counts as part of your mind. Likewise, the internet, Google, and so on, all of these can be seen as, if you like, as part of my extended mind. And as we're becoming more and more integrated with the technologies around us, I think you can see our minds, our brains in a way, as leaking out into the world in this very interesting way. Like everything, technology has good effects and bad effects. It can be used for good and it can be used for bad. But I guess I tend towards the optimistic side. People say things like, is Google making us dumber? It's like, we used to be able to do this stuff in our head. We used to remember stuff, and now we use Google. We have to look it up. So it's a crutch. We used to remember phone numbers. Now it's all on your iPhone. Once you adopt the perspective of the extended mind, it's no longer quite so depressing. I've actually got a better memory than I used to have. I can remember many more phone numbers than I ever could in the days before the iPhone, because I've got this little portable memory that goes around with me and enables me to remember all kinds of stuff. Likewise, Google makes me much more knowledgeable than I used to be. I've got all this knowledge at my fingertips, in effect, as if it was inside my brain. I think that's basically raising my knowledge base and making me smarter. Now, of course, there's potential downside. So just say my internet connection goes down. Well, so much for Google, and I'm probably back below baseline. I leave my iPhone at home, and my memory's not so good. So I guess our minds are maybe made a bit more vulnerable to loss. But when things are working right and you're hooked up to the world, I think, it's not clear to me that we should see this as a negative. I think it's a positive. The thought that we've got this brain at the center, but then we've got all these tools we're interacting with that serve to extend the brain itself. So I suppose once you get rid of the brain and, the core of me, then as far as the extended mind is concerned, there's not going to be much of a mind left. But there will be all these traces, as you say, and from all these traces of me, writings, film, and so on, maybe people's memories and so on, maybe there's the possibility of reconstructing a mind from that, and maybe that is our best route to immortality.